Hello everyone, this is a video regarding the lowest GDP numbers that have been provided by the latest first advanced estimates given by the National Statistics Organization, which works under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. So according to these estimates, which are generally coming in the month of January every year, the real GDP growth rate stands at 6.4%. That is the projection that we have. And these are first advanced estimates, as I mentioned earlier. These first advanced estimates, are one of the advanced estimates. There will be a second advanced estimate in the month of February. We'll look at all those estimates when they are released and their significance in the later part. And to just give you a context, the last year's growth rate stood at 8.2%. That is a drop of 2% overall. And then when we look at the nominal GDP and the real GDP, there is one catch here. The real GDP estimate is $3.8 trillion. That's a humongous improvement. So we used to stand at $2 trillion just some 7-8 years ago. Now we are at $3.8 trillion. However, the worrying fact is that the 57% of the nominal GDP that we have today, 57% of nominal GDP is what this $3.8 trillion is, which means the remaining 43% is because of the inflation. So inflation is a big worry. So that's what we take away from the latest estimates. So when we look at the trends, just if we go back a bit, few more years back, when we look at the trend as to how the GDP growth rate has been, you look at FY21. So this is the lowest growth rate we have seen since pandemic, right? Since the last 4 years, in the sense since pandemic. So this is the pandemic year. We are talking about FY21. FY21 is nothing but starting from April 1st of 2020 to March 31st of 2021. That is FY21. So that year, that was a pandemic year, and we had a real GDP growth rate of minus 7.3%. There was a contraction because of all the restrictions that were there on the movement of people, the social distancing that that was there, and also the lockdown that prevailed at that point. So because of that, the economic activity had to stop. It had come to a stall. So we were at minus 7.3%. That was a contraction. Later on, there was a significant improvement. The growth rate, there was a sharp rebound. Look at this, the difference, minus 7.3 to 8. That is like 15% growth all of a sudden. How did this happen? See, even a small improvement looks like a huge improvement, just because what was normal goes into negative, and even if things come back to normal, that will look like a huge improvement. That is what is known as the base effect. It was because of the base effect we see such a sharp improvement all of a sudden, because restrictions were removed, the COVID had receded, the COVID-19 receded. So because of that base effect, we see a sharp improvement. After that, harmonization happened, right? Measures were taken by the government to boost the economic activity, because of which we see the post-robust COVID recovery, which stood at 7% in the FY23. Last year, that is the FY24, was the best year in terms of GDP growth rate. So people, had more money in their hands. The economic activity also was, all good. And because of which there was a strong consumer demand. We saw a 8.2% growth rate in the fiscal year FY24. And now we have a drop to 6.4%. That is the first advanced estimate. That's what it's saying. It's a drop from 8.2. This has been the trend. But when we look at the overall trends since the FY20, the CAGR, the compounded annual growth rate, stands at 4.8% since FY20. So just to give you the context again, compare it to the average growth rate since 1991 till 2000 almost, right? 2014 almost. So it stands at 7%, right? So this 4.8% is very less if we consider from 2020. But there is this one bad year, right? Because of this one bad year, the entire average, right, gets spoiled. The next thing we are going to look at is the first advanced estimates. I told you about the first advanced estimates. What are these estimates all about? So we get say several estimates every year. So the first advanced estimates come in the month of January. The significance of these estimates are that these are the estimates on the basis of which the decisions are made, especially in the budget. So the budget is produced on February 1st every year. So these numbers become important to make the decisions in the budget, to make the allocations in the budget. The second advanced estimates, these are the updated numbers, right? Why? Because the fiscal year ends only on March 31st, but you are giving advanced estimates. Before the end of the year, you are giving an advanced estimate. So February, you get one more set of numbers. They are somewhat updated, right? And next, you get the provisional estimates. This is after the end of the fiscal year. Usually, you get it in the month of May. So the significance of this is that you get the accurate data because the year is complete. You get accurate data. For example, the 8.2% which we talk about of the last year, that is based on your provisional estimates. Okay. Later on, you get the revised estimates. This is something which incorporates all the additional data. If there is something extra, some data is missing, so that data will be added. This comes few months after May. And then you have the quarterly estimates. So this is the one which gives us the idea about the economic trends, the economic activity trends that are there in the country throughout the year, right? Every 3 months once you get the trend. And then if there are any seasonal variations that are happening, that also is factored in the quarterly estimates. You get to know, right, as to what is happening in the economic activities. And then you have the final estimates. These are the most accurate estimates, and these are the most comprehensive figures. This takes almost a year, right? This takes almost a year for you to get it. So probably by the time you get the second advanced estimates, you generally get the final estimates as well. And then the causes. What are the causes as to why there was such a huge drop? Such a huge drop of the growth rate, the real GDP growth rate in the FY 2025. That is the estimate that's saying it. That is the projection we have. One reason is the manufacturing sector, which has had a sluggish growth. This could be observed even in the previous quarter. When we look at the previous quarter numbers, we see that the manufacturing sector is struggling. This is one. Second, you look at the private sector. The private sector, when it comes to the capital expenditure, that is the investment part. So they have been rather skeptical. It plays a very significant role in terms of making the investments. At the same time, we are talking about employment generation. Without employment, demand will be on the lower side. So the private sector capital expenditure, we call it as a capex. So that has been not so good. Why it has not been so good? There is a lack of investment because they are very cautious business sentiment, because there are some uncertainties, economic uncertainties, and there are geopolitical tensions that are ongoing. So whenever business decisions are made, several factors are to be taken into consideration. So the same thing you see, this sentiment can be seen even in your stock markets. So how they react, right? And then you have the base effect. To sustain something on a higher level for too long is difficult. So after 2020, after the COVID, there was a recovery. After the recovery, so we have been doing well consistently for the last 3 years, 3 to 4 years now, 3 years to be precise. So after these 3 years, to maintain a higher level of growth rate from what 8.2%, you can't go higher than that, right, on a consistent basis. So because last year we had grown well already, so you can't grow much better. So even a small drop would look like, okay, that's not much of an improvement. So 6.2% is positive, but still it feels like it is lesser. That is the effect of the base. We call it as the base effect. So it's challenging to sustain the growth rate over a longer period of time. And then you have the tight monetary policy. Because of the inflationary trend we have, high inflationary trend we have, the RBI has been rather strict. It has been hawkish when it comes to the stance it has taken. And also the fiscal side. See, whenever the RBI is having a tight monetary policy, it means the interest rates will be higher in the economy, because of which investments will be lesser, because the interest rates are higher. I would not borrow and make an investment. And at the same time, the government's hands are also tied, because it has a fiscal responsibility. It cannot spend however it wants. So there is something called as FRBM Act. So it has to keep in mind the fiscal discipline, and then only it can spend. So until and unless somebody is spending rather freely, you can't expect the economic activity to be better. So for the rebound to happen now, probably somebody has to take the lead. It is probably going to be the government. We are going to have a look at it. And then there was this general elections. Every time there are general elections or any elections anywhere, if there are elections in 5 or 6 big states, assembly elections or general elections at large, we see that the economic momentum will be broken. Why is it so? Because the policy decisions will not be made as usual. At the same time, the businesses also play the wait and see game. So we are going to wait and see who is going to come to power. After that, we'll make some investment decisions. So that is also one of the factors why the economic momentum takes a break. And then we have the components of GDP. When we look at the various components of GDP, you'll get a better perspective on it as to how the GDP numbers have performed. So when we look at the components of GDP, we are talking about the expenditure method. So in the expenditure method, to calculate the GDP, we have C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C is private final consumption expenditure. This is the first component. I is the investment expenditure, that is your gross fixed capital formation. And G is the government final consumption expenditure. This is the third component. And X minus M is one factor. We call it as NX, net exports. So there is a fourth factor. How have these factors, which together contribute to the overall GDP number that we get, how have they performed? So we are talking about GDP at market prices. How have they performed? So when we look at the largest component is the private final consumption expenditure, and it contributes to 60% of the GDP. And what we see in this particular component is that the present estimates say that 7.3% growth is there. However, this consumption expenditure has been rather sluggish since fiscal year 20, FY20. So the overall CAGR, when you look at it, it has been just at 4.8%. The biggest component is not growing so well. It is not picking up pace. So the consumer expenditure is not robust enough. So probably they are saving a lot. And then when we look at the second component, we'll come to the government final expenditure later. The second component, which is about the investment, this contributes to 30% of the GDP. So this expenditure that we make on the investments, we are talking about the investments made by the firms, the investments made by the people in housing, in real estate. So this contributes to 30% of the GDP. And how it has performed? It is projected at 6.3% growth rate. However, it has been showing a declining trend since 2014. Which one? The investment expenditure. And then you have the government final expenditure, which is the third component, which contributes to 10% almost. So this one has not been so encouraging again. It is expected to grow at 4.2%. Not much of a contribution to the overall growth rate. Net exports, on the other hand, is typically negative in case of India. Why? Because it is X minus M, exports minus imports. So exports are always less than imports in case of India. That is why that will be in negative. However, in the recent past, exports have picked up and import dependency has reduced, because of which, this is somewhat okay. Not great, but okay. And with all of this in mind, what is to be done now? With the estimates that we have at our hand, what is to be done? The government and the finance ministry is supposed to take the steps for policy stimulation. So policies should be made in order to stimulate the economic activity again. Both the RBI and the government organizations or the government agencies had expected a higher growth rate for this fiscal, but they have been kind of stunned because the real numbers do not match the estimates they had or the projections they had. So it is time for a reality check. That's what we can say for the policy makers, including the RBI and the finance ministry. Now strategic interventions are to be made so that the economic activities are again stimulated, and the pressure will clearly be on the fiscal policy in order to make some changes so that investment picks up, consumption picks up. So probably it has to loosen its hand a bit and probably let the money flow rather easily. And this is where we come to the union budget. So with all these numbers and the trends that we have, union budget is going to take some information, some ideas from these estimates and probably have the allocations made accordingly. So hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching.